The old man's cane trembled against the cracked sidewalk as laughter sliced through the evening air like shrapnel. At 91, Elias Kane had seen wars, buried friends, and carried scars no one could see, but the jeers of 3 teenagers, their voices sharp with mockery, cut deeper than he'd expected. "Go back to your museum, old man," one shouted, tossing an empty soda can that clattered at his feet. Elias didn't flinch. His cloudy blue eyes, framed by wrinkles like battle maps, fixed on the horizon where the sun bled orange over the sleepy town of Willow Creek. He'd walked this street every evening for decades, a ritual to quiet the ghosts of his past. But tonight, those ghosts felt louder than ever. The boys circled closer, their sneakers scuffing the pavement, their words a cruel mimicry of his slow, deliberate steps. "What's that medal on your chest? You steal it from a pawn shop?" Another sneered, emboldened by his friend's snickers. Elias clutched the bronze star pinned to his faded jacket, a relic from a war the world had half forgotten. He said nothing, only turned toward his small, weathered house at the end of Maple Street, the weight of their laughter trailing him like smoke. Inside, the house was a shrine to a life of quiet sacrifice. Black and white photos lined the walls. Young Elias in a crisp uniform, grinning beside comrades who never came home. A younger Elias holding his wife, Margaret, now gone 10 years. A single snapshot of a daughter who hadn't spoken to him in decades. He sank into his armchair, the springs creaking under his frail frame, and stared at the medal in his hand. It wasn't the taunts that stung, it was the fear that his life, his losses, meant nothing to a world that moved on without him. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. Elias woke to the sound of voices outside, not the usual hum of passing cars but a low, steady murmur, like a gathering storm. He shuffled to the window, pulling back the curtain with trembling fingers. A line of people stretched from his doorstep down the street, neighbors, shopkeepers, even strangers, their faces a mix of solemnity and purpose. At the front stood Clara, the librarian, her arms crossed, her eyes fierce. "We heard what happened," she said when Elias opened the door, her voice trembling with something between anger and pride. "And we're here to set it right." Elias blinked, his throat tight. He didn't understand, not yet. Clara stepped forward, holding a small, leather-bound book. "This was in the library archives," she said. "Your story, Elias. The real one." She opened it to a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1945, headlined, "Local Boy Saves Platoon in Ardennes." The article detailed his courage, how he dragged 3 wounded soldiers through a blizzard under enemy fire, earning the Bronze Star that now hung on his chest. Elias stared, his breath shallow. He'd never spoken of it, not to Margaret, not to anyone. The town had known him as the quiet old man who walked Maple Street, not a hero. The crowd grew as the morning unfolded. Old Mr. Hensley from the hardware store stepped forward, his voice gruff. "I fought in Korea. Never saw anything like what you did." A young mother, cradling a toddler, pressed a handwritten note into Elias's hand. "Thank you for my freedom." The high school history teacher, Mr. Patel, arrived with a group of students, not the boys from last night, but others, their eyes wide with awe. "We're teaching your story in class now," Patel said. "It's time they know." Elias felt his knees weaken, not from age but from the weight of their gratitude. He leaned on his cane, searching for words, but none came. The teenager's mockery had cracked something open, but this outpouring was mending it in ways he hadn't thought possible. Then, a new figure pushed through the crowd, a woman in her 60s with sharp green eyes and a hesitant smile. Elias froze. It was Sarah, his daughter. "I saw it online," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone posted about what happened last night. I didn't know, Dad." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, the years of silence between them seemed to dissolve. Elias reached out, his hand trembling, and she took it, her grip warm and firm. The crowd watched in reverent silence, sensing the weight of their reunion. By noon, the line stretched around the block. People brought flowers, baked goods, letters, tokens of respect for a man they'd overlooked for too long. Elias stood on his porch, overwhelmed, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and disbelief. The town hadn't just come to apologize, they'd come to claim him as their own. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across Maple Street, as the crowd outside Elias Kane's house showed no sign of thinning. He stood on his porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing, trying to process the faces before him, some familiar, some strangers, all looking at him with a reverence that felt both foreign and heavy. Sarah, his daughter, lingered at his side, her presence a quiet miracle after years of estrangement, but her eyes darted nervously, as if she, too, was grappling with the weight of this moment. Clara, the librarian, took charge, organizing the crowd into a semblance of order. She brought more from the archives, letters Elias had written home during the war, donated by his late wife, Margaret, decades ago. "You never told anyone," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "But Margaret wanted the town to know who you were." Elias's chest tightened at the mention of his wife. He'd always thought his silence protected her from the horrors he'd seen, but now he wondered if it had built a wall instead. As the day wore on, stories poured out. A gray-haired woman, Mrs. Callahan, shared how Elias had fixed her roof after a storm in '73, refusing payment. A man in a postal uniform recounted how Elias had walked his route with him during a brutal winter, just to keep him company. Each tale chipped away at the image of the quiet old man, revealing a life woven into the fabric of Willow Creek. Elias listened, his eyes stinging, feeling like he was meeting himself for the first time. Then came the twist no one expected. A boy stepped forward, no older than 16, his face flushed with guilt. It was one of the teenagers from last night, Jake, the one who'd thrown the soda can. The crowd stiffened, murmurs rippling through them, but Jake raised his hands, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kane," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "I didn't know. We were stupid." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a printout of the same article Clara had shown. "I looked you up after what we did. I told my mom, and she said I had to come here." Elias studied the boy, his thin frame trembling under the weight of his confession. The crowd waited, some glaring, others curious. Elias felt a flicker of the anger from last night, but it faded as he saw the boy's eyes-rimmed, earnest. "Takes guts to own a mistake," Elias said finally, his voice steady but kind. "You're here now? That's what matters." The crowd exhaled, some nodding, others clapping softly. Jake's shoulders slumped in relief, and his mother, standing nearby, mouthed a silent thank you to Elias. Sarah squeezed her father's arm, her own guilt surfacing. "I should have been here sooner," she whispered. "I let Mom's death come between us." Elias shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that he'd pushed her away too, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he patted her hand, hoping she'd understand. By evening, the crowd had transformed the street into a makeshift vigil. Lanterns glowed, casting a warm light over the faces of Willow Creek's residents. Someone started singing an old folk tune Elias hadn't heard since the war, and others joined, their voices rising into the night. Elias felt the ghosts of his past soften, their sharp edges dulled by the community before him. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a cornerstone. But not everyone was ready to celebrate. In the shadows, another teenager from the night before watched, his face hard, unyielding. Unlike Jake, he hadn't come to apologize. Elias caught his eye, and for a moment, the boy's defiance flickered, but he turned and slipped into the crowd, leaving a question mark in Elias's mind. The lanterns flickered as night settled over Willow Creek, the crowd's warmth a stark contrast to the chill in Elias Kane's bones. He sat on his porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders by Sarah, who hadn't left his side since her arrival. The town's outpouring had stitched together pieces of his heart he'd thought long broken, but a quiet unease lingered, the memory of the second teenager's defiant stare. Sarah noticed his distant look. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Elias nodded, but his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for that boy. He didn't know his name, but the hardness in his gaze had stirred something in Elias, a memory of himself at that age, angry at a world that seemed to owe him more. He wondered if the boy was still out there, carrying his resentment like a grenade. The night deepened, and the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind flowers, cards, and a sense of unity Willow Creek hadn't felt in years. Clara stayed late, helping Elias sort through the gifts. She handed him a small, worn journal, its cover embossed with his initials. "This was with Margaret's donations," she said. I think she wanted you to have it back. Elias opened it, his breath catching at the sight of his own handwriting letters he'd written in foxholes, scribbled prayers for his men, confessions of fear he'd never voiced. One entry stood out. If I make it home, I'll live quietly. No hero's parade. Just a life that means something. He closed the journal, his hands trembling. Sarah, reading over his shoulder, rested her hand on his. You did that, Dad, she said. You meant something to all these people. Elias wanted to believe her, but the boy's face haunted him. He'd seen too many young men lost to anger, in war and in peace, and he couldn't shake the need to reach him. The next morning, Elias woke with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He asked Sarah to drive him to the high school, where Mr. Patel, the history teacher, had invited him to speak. The auditorium was packed with students, their faces a mix of curiosity and restlessness. Elias stood at the podium, his cane steadying him, and told his story, not just the heroics of the Ardennes, but the fear, the loss, the nights he'd wept for his fallen friends. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Then he saw him, the boy from the crowd, slouched in the back row, his arms crossed. Elias paused, meeting his gaze. I saw a young man last night, he said, his voice clear. He was angry. I don't know why, but I know that feeling. I was angry too once. Were taught me it doesn't fix anything. The boy shifted, his jaw tight, but he didn't look away. Elias continued, speaking directly to him now. You don't have to carry that anger alone. This town, this room is full of people who'll listen. After the talk, students swarmed Elias, asking questions, shaking his hand. The boy lingered, hesitant, then approached. Name's Tyler, he said gruffly. I was one of them. The other night. Elias nodded, waiting. Tyler's voice cracked. My dad left. Mom's always working. I didn't mean to, he trailed off, and Elias saw the weight of a life he hadn't understood. You're here now, Elias said, echoing his words to Jake. That's a start. Tyler nodded, his eyes downcast but softer. Sarah, watching from the side, smiled faintly, pride flickering in her gaze. As they drove home, Elias felt a quiet victory, not just for himself, but for Tyler, for the town, for the bridges being built where walls had stood. Days passed, and Willow Creek seemed to hum with a new rhythm. Elias Kane's story had spread beyond Maple Street, carried by word of mouth and social media posts that Sarah helped him navigate. His small house, once a quiet refuge, now welcomed visitors, daily neighbors dropping off casseroles, students with questions for school projects, even veterans from nearby towns who wanted to shake his hand. Elias felt the weight of his 91 years lighten, as if the town's embrace had given him back a piece of his youth. Sarah stayed, her suitcase now a fixture in the guest room. They talked late into the nights, piecing together the years they'd lost. She told him about her life in Chicago, her job as a nurse, the guilt that had kept her away after Margaret's death. Elias shared stories he'd buried, nights in the Ardennes, the men he couldn't save, the hope that had kept him going. Each conversation felt like a step toward healing, though both knew some wounds would never fully close. The town, too, was changing. Clara organized a community project to preserve Willow Creek's history, starting with Elias's story. Mr. Patel's students launched a podcast, interviewing veterans and sharing their tales. Even Jake and Tyler became involved, volunteering at the library to digitize old records. Elias watched their transformation with quiet pride, remembering the boys they'd been just days ago. Tyler, especially, seemed lighter, his defiance replaced by a cautious hope. He'd started visiting Elias, asking about the war, about life. You ever feel like giving up? He asked one afternoon, sitting on the porch. Elias nodded. Every day, son, but you keep going. For the ones who can't. One evening, the town council arrived with a proposal, a memorial plaque in the town square, honoring Elias and other local veterans. Elias protested, never wanted fanfare, but Sarah and Clara insisted. It's not just for you, Clara said. It's for everyone who needs to remember what courage looks like. The ceremony was set for the following week, and Willow Creek buzzed with preparations. Banners went up, the high school band practiced, and the townsfolk planned a potluck that promised to outdo any in memory. The day of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear. Elias stood in the square, leaning on his cane, Sarah at his side. The crowd was larger than he'd expected, spilling across the grass, their faces glowing with pride. Jake and Tyler stood near the front, both wearing ties, their eyes bright with purpose. The mayor unveiled the plaque, engraved with Elias's name and a simple inscription, "For those who served, and those who remember." Elias's throat tightened as the crowd applauded, the sound rolling over him like a wave. He spoke briefly, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm no hero," he said. "I just did what needed doing. You Aluri the ones making this means something." He looked at Sarah, at Jake, at Tyler, at the faces of a town that had become his family. For the first time in years, he felt whole. As the band played and the potluck began, Elias sat under an oak tree, watching children chase each other and neighbors laugh over plates of food. Sarah joined him, her hand finding his. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. Elias smiled, his eyes tracing the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold. He thought of Margaret, of his lost comrades, of the life he'd lived in their shadow. Maybe, he thought, he'd done enough. But in the crowd, a new face caught his eye, a man, older, watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Elias didn't know him, but something in his posture, the way he clutched a folded photograph, felt familiar. A new story, perhaps, waiting to be told.